So I wanted an excuse to build the Buster Sword from Final Fantasy VII. So this year I went as Cloud for Halloween. I looked around a lot on the internet and I didn't find a lot of tutorials and such. I mean, I found kind of bits and pieces on forums and stuff. So I thought I'd put together a little video to help you all out there who are looking to build a sword, or or if you were just curious about it. And at the end I'll have all the stats on all the cuts of the sword, and how long everything needs to be, and the exact products I use to kind of get the final look. I got everything but the leather wrap from just a hardware store from Home Depot, so it's kind of your one-stop shop for this project. You'll need a couple power tools to get this done. You're going to need a circular saw and a circular sander to really get the blade looking right. So I started with a piece of pine. You'll want to use pine because it's probably the lightest, most durable wood I could find. If you use anything else aside from pine, it's going to be very, very heavy. So first I got the piece of pine and I cut out the general shape, right? Just the Buster Sword shape. Then, before I did anything else, I cut out the holes, the materia holes, right? Because when you start to treat the wood, you already want those holes cut so everything gets treated together and you don't have to go back and retreat things after you start cutting it. Once I had it cut out and I had the holes drilled, then came for one of the more difficult parts, which is why you're going to need the orbital sander, and that's creating the actual blade itself, right? Because you want it to come to a point all the way around. And since it's a 5-foot long sword, it takes a long time. After I drew it all out, I got out my circular saw and I set the board up on its end, right? And this is kind of a little dangerous. Set it up on its end, and I took the circular saw, put it at the angle that I wanted, and just cut along the whole board. And that gave me an edge on one side, a nice flat edge. Now it didn't get me all the way to where I want the blade to be, but it cut off a nice straight chunk of wood for me, right? And then I took the saw, I flipped the board around, and I cut along the other side. And it gave me two great lines, and it gave me the starting point of the blade. And once I had those planes to go on, I took the circular sander all the way up and down the blade until I got the 2 points to meet. And then it gave me a great edge and it looked great. The biggest issue with this project, and the hardest thing, is to get wood to look like metal, because wood is very porous, it absorbs a lot of moisture. So you'll notice when you start to paint that you won't be able to get rid of the wood grain for a very long time. When I started to paint the piece of wood, I started with a shellac to kind of fill in all those air pockets and air holes. So I started with probably 3 or 4 coats of shellac, and between each coat I would do a light sanding of like 200 grit, and I'd get one of those sanding bricks. So that's how I started, with a couple coats of shellac, and then once I was satisfied with that, I got it feeling real smooth, I moved on to a flat gray primer. The darker your primer, I have found, the more rich your paint job comes out at the end. Once I did the primer, then I started with paint. So I got 2 types of paint just because of how the sword's always been, right? It has a really dark gunmetal gray for the most of the part of the sword, and then it has that lighter gray that's kind of the blade edge of the sword. So I wanted to get that contrast in there. So I got a real dark gunmetal gray and a light gray. And I started by coloring first the dark part of the blade. So what I did is I started off by just painting the entire sword the dark gunmetal gray. And I did the same process where I would paint it, let it dry, sand it, paint it, let it dry, sand it, paint it, let it dry, sand it. Because you want to get that layered, and you're still probably fighting the wood grain even at this point. It's going to absorb a lot of paint. You'll be very surprised when you start to do this. After I painted the whole sword a dark gray, taped off the whole sword so only the blade was exposed, right? And you be sure to tape off the whole thing. You don't want any spray offs getting onto your dark paint job you've done, because it probably looks great at this point. So then what you're going to do is you're going to take your light gray now, and I started coating that as well, and it was the same process. I took it outside, I got just a big piece of cardboard, and I started spraying it, letting it dry, spraying it, just once again, multiple layers, I like 3 or 4 coats. And then I started on the hilt portion of it, right? So now I just have a big chunk of wood that looks like a big blade, but nothing else, right? So I needed to start on the hilt, right? The measurements you'll see will include all of these lengths in it. So the hilt is actually just a piece of aluminum sheeting I got from Home Depot. It came in like a 12 by 12 inch sheet. I think it was 20 gauge aluminum. And I cut out a 3-inch piece, you'll have to cut out 2 rows of 3-inch to wrap it all the way around the blade. and then I got some Gorilla Glue and I just glued it to the wood at the very bottom of the hilt. Alright? And I just took a hammer and I dented it around the corners to get the corners. Now, what you're going to do is you'll bend the two pieces together and you're going to get this ugly seam, and we'll take care of that in a little bit. So once I had that secured in place, I let that dry. Then another difficult part of the sword building process, and that's getting your handle to attach to the sword and for it to be sturdy enough to support all this weight, right? So what I ended up doing is I ended up getting a piece of electrical conduit, 3/4 inch piece of electrical conduit, which is hollow, and you'll find it in the electrical portion of Home Depot. And what I did is I drilled a hole into the sword with a drill bit, one size smaller than the piece of electrical conduit. So since it was a 3/4 inch, I think I drilled a 1/2 inch hole or a 5/8 hole, something like that. And the reason you do that is because once you have the hole drilled, you're going to want to basically hammer in the electrical conduit like it's a giant nail into the sword. Because I did a couple tests and I couldn't get the handle to stay in any other way other than with some serious pressure. So I drilled a big hole in the base of the sword before you get to the material holes, of course, right? So you have about 3 or 4 inches to work with. And then you just start hammering. If you have a rubber hammer, that's great, and you just start hammering that electrical conduit into the sword. So then it's all held in by pressure, and it worked wonderfully, right? It's not loose, it doesn't jiggle, it just feels like it's all one piece. So once I had the electrical conduit now, I went back to the seams on that aluminum sheeting I was telling you about, where the two pieces of aluminum meet. There's going to be an ugly seam, right? So I bought what's called steel stick, which is basically it's metal mixed with Play-Doh, and you can kind of fill in all these gaps, right? So we're gonna have all these seams. We're gonna have seams where the two pieces of metal overlap. We're gonna have seams where the top of the hilt and the bottom of the sword meet. You're gonna want to kind of make all nice and smooth. And then you're gonna have a seam which is not necessary, but a seam where the handle is going to meet the blade that you can kind of fill in. And it just kind of removes all the seams, and it starts to give your sword a much more finished look, so people don't really know how you did it. Another part of this that I ran into at the end that hopefully you can avoid is once you've applied that aluminum plating, you're gonna notice that there's a gap, right? Because you're creating this square box with the aluminum, and you've cut a blade into your wood, right? So there's going to be 2 holes on each side where there was a box now, and you have a bladed shape and a box, so there's going to be gaps. Now I filled that in with some wood filler that I had already, which worked really well. It just kind of filled it in, and I actually stuffed it all with aluminum foil, and then to finish it, I just did some wood filler. You can also do the steel stick. The steel stick comes in very limited amounts, and it's pretty expensive, so I used wood filler on those 2 big gaps if you run into that issue. Once I had the seams all filled in, I started working on kind of some finishing touches. So I got a couple pieces once again from the electrical department at Home Depot as a pommel for the weapon to kind of give it something, kind of for the end to make it look like, a sword. So I got 2 pieces. I got a pommel piece, and then I got a piece where the handle joins the sword. Before I put those on, I aged them. And this is kind of where I went away from the video game look and went more towards one of Zach's looks from one of the other tons of games they've done before, where he kind of has like a goldish, blackish finish to the hilt. So that's what I did. I ended up taking black spray paint and spray painting all of the metal pieces. So that's the pommel, that's the connector from the handle to the weapon, and even the aluminum wrapping around the corner. I've taped everything else off, and I aged all of it. And I aged it all by first spray painting it with a shiny black, and then taking a nice gold and spray painting on a piece of paper, getting a paper towel, and just dabbing it all over. And it kind of gave it a really nice aged metal look, and it made the whole weapon look much more real at that point. And then what I did is I went to a fabric store and I bought some just really dark red leather, and I cut it into strips. You start wrapping it in red leather, right? And you're going to want to wrap it really tight so when people hold the weapon, it doesn't shift around on you. It just feels good, and it feels as it should. And then at the end, since I got a little end electrical conduit piece, I could already just screw it on the end. So I just screwed it on the end. I just tucked the rest of the leather in there and just screwed it in, and it kind of just all fit real snug. If you work with all electrical conduit pieces, you can work all in the same measurements. You can get a 3/4 inch everything, and everything matches up really well, like it was made to fit together. I was finished, but I noticed that the sword was very front end heavy. And it's going to be basically no matter what you do. But what I did to counteract that a little bit is I bought just a piece of iron bar from the hardware store, a 1/2 inch iron bar, and since the electrical conduit handle is hollow, I just got a piece of that iron bar and just stuck it in there, covered in Gorilla Glue, stuck it in there so it would set in, and it kind of gave some additional weight to the handle side, which made for carrying the sword a lot easier. And then after that, you're done. You got a great weapon. Mine stands about 6 feet tall, so just over the top of my head, and I love it. It now sits up in my house, and I'll have it forever. If you all have any questions, just comment below, and I'll watch for them, and I'll try to answer anything if anybody has any questions. I hope you guys have as much fun as I did making the weapon. It took me about probably 3 weeks, 3 solid weekends, and I couldn't be happier with it. Thanks for watching.